Good morning, everyone. I'm gonna make a start. I was waiting for Valentina just to give me the green light to go because I know that they had the doors closed, so some people were late getting in. But I think we're ready to go. I know everyone is very busy today, so I'm going to keep to time so that you are out of here at the time that you thought you were going to be departing. I hope day one was amazing for everyone. It's such a busy show this year, so I'm really excited to share some of the insights that we gathered last year, which hopefully will give you some inspiration and some things to look out for as you're going around Essence and smelling some of the novelties that are launching in 2024. This presentation that I'm giving you is really focusing on two pieces of data. The first on the left, 7%. We recorded 3,314 fragrances launched in 2023, which resulted in a 7% growth on 2022. So that's one piece of information that we're going to delve into a little bit more detail. The other piece of information is this one here, 970%. It's quite a big number. Last year we recorded 1,563 new launches, which we classified as niche. This is compared to 146 fragrances, niche fragrances, in 2003. At the end of the presentation, one of the things that you would have seen, and maybe this is what inspired you to come today, was around this definition of niche. And the definition of niche that we currently use was really a definition which was created in around the early 2000s, when there were only a handful of niche fragrance brands. You can see that with 970% growth, is that definition still relevant today? I can't say that I have the answer. This is something that our team are currently working through, but I'm happy to share some of the thought process that we're currently thinking about in terms of how we approach this definition of niche. Also, because we're at Essence, if you want to compare the first year of Essence, which was 2009, there's been a 317% increase last year if you compare the number of niche fragrances we recorded when Essence began in 2009. So that's what we're going to talk about. If you haven't met me, my name is Clayton. I'm the Evaluation and Communications Manager at Fragrances of the World. You might see two of my colleagues who are here with me today, and we're going around doing what we do and what we have done at every Essence since 2009, which is meeting with brands, understanding the new launches that they're bringing into the market, talking with either their perfumers or their creative directors or their marketing teams, and gathering all of that information for our database. So you'll see in the room today we have Margaret Curry, who's our Chief Operating Officer, and Erica Moore, who is our Head of Evaluation. So if you don't talk to me, feel free to talk to the two other colleagues that I have in the room. They're in the middle there. They're happy to answer any questions that you have about Fragrances of the World. But if you're not familiar with what we do, Michael Edwards is our founder. He created Fragrances of the World in 1983. It really came out of a need that Michael saw in the industry where he was meeting and talking with perfumers who have a very technical language, but he found that when you are in a retail environment, speaking with everyday consumers who don't know perfume, for them, the language of a perfumer is too technical, but it also doesn't help them to dream about the product and to imagine themselves in the story of a perfume. So he created Fragrances of the World to really help people navigate the world of perfumery in a very simple and easy way to understand. So if we fast forward to 2024, Michael Edwards and our team, we've classified over 52,000 fragrances in our database. And we'll talk about what classification means in our context as we go through the presentation. Some other points about what we do. One of the first things that Michael wanted to do is to provide the world with a guide. So he created his first guidebook in 1984. And this was because he found that when he was asking people for their favorite fragrances, give them 2 or 3 options, those fragrances typically belong to one olfactive family. So he thought that was really interesting, and he thought, well, Could it be as simple as, if they like a particular olfactive family, give them a list of all the other fragrances that are in that olfactive family, and that will help them to navigate the world of perfumery. So this is the concept of the guidebook. And in 2024, we have more than 30 annual guidebooks in existence. Books aren't the only thing we do. Now in the digital age, we have a lot of other ways that we're bringing that data alive to the industry, which we'll talk about. Another key part of Michael's work is the fragrance wheel, which he created in 1992. It was copywritten. And it was the original fragrance wheel because Michael, when he was looking at the previous olfactive classification systems that existed in the world, he found that they were very linear. So it was really just lists of this family, these fragrances. What he liked about the wheel was that it really showed the relationship between the fragrance families and helped people to navigate more smoothly through their choices of, okay, if you like an ambery fragrance, then what would be next to that? Okay, if we add woods, then we'll get a woody amber, or if we're adding incense and spices, we can go to a soft amber. So this was more of a visual guide to help people navigate the world of perfumery. And it's become a standard, which is used around the world to help people classify fragrances. When we were creating the books, we would always use our own internal database. So we had our own computer-based program where we would be entering our data. In 2004, we decided to share that with the world, which became fragrancesoftheworld.info. And this database is currently used by evaluators, perfumers, marketing people, because it gives them access to all of the information that we're collecting and can be used in a number of ways. So if you've ever had a chance to look at our database, you can look at who the perfumer is, who the bottle designer was, what month, year it was launched, olfactive pyramids, and of course our classification, which is where the work of Erica, myself, and Michael are involved in working with brands to make sure that the fragrances are correctly classified. So when you smell something, it is that olfactive family, and you can find things that are similar. And that's really the philosophy of Fragrances of the World. Our work is used by Wiki Parfum, a collaboration that we have with Puig, and also Fragrance Finders, which is something that we found as we came into COVID. A lot of retailers, when their stores had to physically close, but their online channels remained open, it became a big opportunity for us. And we spoke about this last year at Essence, how Fragrance Finders were giving people a new experience of how they can shop for fragrances online. And we have other software applications. If there's anyone in-house here from Symrise, this is another of our partners where we've created their internal database that their perfumers, their evaluators use for their own internal fragrance database. So there's many ways that we share our data, but I guess the key thing is that when we're going to shows like this and collecting all of the data, it allows us to come up with some very accurate insights, which is what I wanted to share with you today. I mentioned that there was a 7% growth. So 2023, we recorded 3,314 fragrances, which was up 7% on 2022. We've had a few unusual years, given we went through COVID, which really impacted the trajectory of particularly niche perfume. But if you look at our data, you'll see that niche perfume really carried the industry with numbers through that period. We're finding that is now starting to level out, and we're seeing more consistent numbers, and we're returning to the growth that we saw pre-pandemic. But I remember when we were here last year speaking with a lot of the brands, there was a lot of uncertainty around geopolitical activity, of how that would impact different markets. Also, there was a glass shortage, so a lot of our brands that we were speaking with were talking about holding off launches because either they didn't have the glass or they had to focus the glass that they could have on their best sellers and maintaining stock for current product. So that had a bit of an impact, I think, in 2022, which saw the number drop a little bit. But we're finding now, and even just if you walked around yesterday, you can see there's a real energy, and I think the numbers are going to be very, very high for 2024. I'm pretty certain of that. We're also finding that when we speak to retailers, there's a real push to get consumers back in store. to have in-store shopping experiences after COVID. So that, of course, is creating a need for brands to launch more product so that there's more novelty and more interest to bring people in store. So that is also having an impact on the numbers as well. Now, if we cut the numbers by distribution, again, this is really interesting if you look at the definition of niche. Niche, by definition, means a smaller part of something bigger. But if you look at the numbers, niche is the biggest part. So that's a really interesting thing to think about in terms of what is a niche fragrance, when the majority of fragrances that we're entering into our database are categorized under this, this banner of niche. We can talk about some definitions towards the end as we're looking at the definition of niche, but for us, luxury, we wanted to separate that out from niche. A lot of luxury brands will talk about having a niche collection. For example, Chanel Les Exclusives or Hermescence from Hermès. Dior has the private collection. So for us, we didn't want to include these with niche because that can distort the data. So we have a luxury distribution category where we have those collections separated out. And of course, everyone will be familiar with prestige, which is if you're shopping at, say, Sephora or Ici Paris, you'll find those brands that are categorized in that prestige category. The other, although it looks like a big number, is made up of multiple channels. So while insignificant as their own unique channels, together they do provide a significant part of the data. So that's things like lifestyle, mass. We have also direct selling. So this is brands like Avon, if you're from America. So again, very, very small, but still significant. Region growth is something else that is really interesting to look at. Oceania, so this is Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific, has experienced a 47% growth if you're looking over the last 5 years. It's still a very small, and I can say this because I live in Sydney, in Australia, that it is still a small market, but it's certainly significant and there's certainly an interest. So what we're finding, and this is true of all the markets, that countries that don't have a history in perfumery are really starting to become engaged and interested. So consumers are wanting more fragrance, which is creating more brands and more people interested in creating brands in those markets. Of course, Asia is a huge opportunity, I think, for the fragrance industry. And we're seeing that particularly the Chinese market is growing 3 times higher than other markets at present. And we expect that that will continue to boom. And the Middle East, no surprises, love perfume. And so we're still seeing that ongoing growth in the Middle East from brands there. So we've talked about, I guess, the product, how it is created, how it gets into into the retail network. I talked about classification. So the job of our evaluation team, as I mentioned, is to smell things, smell fragrances, work with, if we can, the perfumer or the evaluation team or the brand if they've been given instruction from their perfumer, so that we can translate their olfactive category into our language. Because if you're working across different brands, of course everyone has their own language. The beauty of our system is that everything is translated into the same language, so you can compare the pun apples with apples, oranges with oranges. So if we look at a breakdown of 2023 by olfactive family, the data is not so surprising here. And what we find, I didn't include the 2022 data because it really doesn't change a lot. And what we see is that olfactive trends typically can take at least 5 years to really begin to mature and evolve and change the way this pie graph would look. I'm imagining that's for a few reasons. If, for example, tuberose becomes the new it ingredient that everyone has to have in their fragrance, it's going to take the growers at least 5 years to mature the plants before they can be harvested. And there's a lot of this that goes on. If it's a new molecule, there needs to be some, I guess, testing in the market to make sure that consumers are interested in the molecule. So things can really take time. And if you look at oud, for an example, we did some studies probably about 5 or 7 years ago, how the oud trend took place. You know, you can really track it back to the early 2000s, and it really matured sort of over 10 years later, and is still an important ingredient in perfumery today. We have noticed, though, I think one thing that we've picked up on in the last couple of years is this increase in ambery families. So this is use of things like incense and resins, woody amber molecules. And this can, I think, really be linked to this idea of consumers really wanting long-lasting fragrances. So when you want a long-lasting fragrance, obviously you have to work with olfactive families that allow you to give that tenacity and that longevity in a fragrance, which is why we can see there's a skewing towards more ambery and woody ambery notes. Some ingredients that we're seeing a lot of over the last 12 months. Fresh ginger seems to be a popular ingredient at the moment, as well as cardamom, which isn't necessarily so new over the last year. It's been used a lot in the last 5 to 10 years, actually. But we're finding that people and perfumers are being more adventurous with spices in terms of how they express that tonality of spice, rather than sticking with traditional clove, cinnamon, which obviously has IFRA complications. So again, you have to think about how can you give a spicy note working within the regulations. And also pink pepper has really been used a lot, so we're trying to find new ways to, again, give fresh, cool spiciness. We're seeing a lot of coconut as well, which is such a versatile ingredient. We're seeing it used a lot in sort of solar florals, paired with a lot of white floral notes, so tuberose. Even a lot of men's fragrances now are using coconut, so the lactonic note to give the creaminess with sandalwood, and even a lot of ambery fragrances as well. So coconut seems to be very, very popular. And then also going back to that idea of longevity and really pushing how tenacious fragrances are. So we're seeing a lot of these more rich, intense notes coming up a lot in fragrances. So things like cognac, which sounds very luxurious and very textural and can go from anything with from leather to woods to ambery notes. Incense still continues to be a very, very important fragrance ingredient in perfumery for us. And leather. I'm seeing a lot of leather. If you walk around the show, I was even going to my hotel, and the whole hotel smells like leather. But it's like leather, green, spicy. I feel like that's the leather note that we're getting in 2024 if I had to put my nose to it. And then tobacco. We're finding a lot of tobacco as well. Going back to, for us, a big part of our work is looking at fragrances that have had an impact in history, which are often reference points for perfumers. Tom Ford's Tobacco Vanille is still, I think, a really key fragrance, along with obviously Baccarat Rouge. And we're not just talking about duping. We're really talking about, okay, how do we take that shape and then twist it and make it new and renovate it for a new audience? So we're seeing this with a lot of traditional tobacco accords as well. But if I had to summarize and say 3 trends that we're seeing a lot of. For last year, for us, vanilla seemed to be everywhere. So much so that it was always in the name, or often in the name of the fragrances that it featured heavily in. So some examples, we have Matière Première Vanilla Powder, Electimus, a British brand who's here at Essence this year. So Vanilla Edesia, which was created with Cécile Zarokian. And then Maison Rebacci's Vanilla Riviera. So 3 really different interpretations of vanilla. One was sort of more powdery and comforting. One was more about incense and had touches of oud, as well as some white floral notes. So it's a really, I guess, a interesting ingredient that has been used since the 1920s and beyond, but it seems to have found its place again in modern perfumery. The other fragrance trend that we've picked up on is this idea of like starburst fruits. So it's taking something that's really playful, some types of fruity notes that you would expect to see in a bath product, or something that's not so sophisticated, that's playful, it's young, it's almost, something teenage, high school about it. But then the twist here is that your perfumers are placing it with very sophisticated and very, modern woody notes. So whether that's leather, tobacco again, oud. So we're finding it's sort of this play, and I think it's sort of really, reflecting fashion as well. If you were to think of what a Balenciaga catwalk was 40 years ago, compare that to what you see today. Fashion is really changing and it's evolving. People want to be comfortable, but they also want to be elegant. So this trend sort of really talks to that, of having something that's playful, it's not so serious about itself, but then you still have this beautiful, sophisticated dry down as the fragrance wears. And then the other trend that we've picked up on is may not necessarily be so niche. It's more in our prestige category, but still very important. So this is an iced woods effect that we're finding when you take really robust, nice, comforting, woody notes of cedarwood, sandalwood, or patchouli, and then you're pairing them with juniper, sage, aromatic notes. So it's kind of, going back to that idea of fragrances really needing to have longevity, it's almost a woody fragrance dressed up as an aromatic fougere. The reason why this, I think, is interesting for niche is that it really shows how niche still is the birthplace of a lot of ideas. We can take that back all the way to things like Santal 33, where you had that cool cucumber Undecovertol note with sandalwood, which was quite unique in its time, and that really sort of set the trend for the next decade. And we're still seeing that trickle down now in prestige fragrances, where you have this idea of warm woods, but then you have this cool effect that surrounds it. So those were some of the insights that we took from 2023. So now going back to the other piece of data that I shared, which was the 970% increase in niche fragrances when you compare 2023 back to 2003. So if we think, what has happened? And then I guess the question is, what does it mean to be niche in 2024? If we leave perfume land for a second and we go to someone I'm sure many of you have probably read, which is Simon Sinek. If we look at his model of first asking that question, why? What is my purpose? And then that will impact how you then operate and move through the world and what you do. So if we apply that to niche, if we look back at when niche started, going back into the 1970s with brands like Diptyque, L'Artisan Parfumeur, Annick Goutal, Jo Malone, Serge Lutens, and of course Frederic Malle. So we're spanning here 25 years of history when niche is in its infancy and beginning to bloom. Really interesting when I put this slide together as well, how many of these brands are now acquired and are operated by bigger corporations. So these are some of the conversations we've been having around the definition of niche with both brands, with oil houses, with people that love perfume. It's, how do you really define what it is when the definition was so tight 25 years ago? I'm thinking, the story of L'Artisan Parfumeur's Bana Banana, where you have a creator going to a perfumer and saying, I'm going to a party and I want to smell like a banana because I'm dressed like a banana. How many small brands could go to an oil house, to Givaudan or Firmenich today and say, can you do this for me? No, you can't, because as you can see with the data, 970% growth. The competition is much higher. So the business plan and the business model has to naturally change. So let's look at some of the original characteristics of niche fragrances. And again, these are my thoughts. You might have different thoughts, but it'll be interesting. And we have a little section for Q&A afterwards if you want to discuss this. For me, niche was always about creativity. It was about pushing the boundaries of what you expected perfume to be. And this was often led by an in-house perfumer, or at least a creative director rather than a marketing team or panels that would create the direction of a fragrance. Brand identity. So normally niche would be small, independent, they would be agile, they'd be able to move very quickly. And there's always a focus on storytelling. The other interesting thing about brand identity is that often if we look back at those initial niche fragrance houses, often they were people that came from the larger industry and they're a little bit unhappy with their experience there, so they broke away to create something smaller that they could control and do something different. That's changed now because we're seeing that often niche is the birthplace for small brands desiring to get merged back into the large, the bigger. So things again have changed. Visual identity. This is something that we've talked about a lot with oil houses who all have their own definition of niche, but we typically agree that it's often uniform packaging, so often a classic stock bottle. So the focus was always on the juice, the story, rather than spending a lot of money on advertising and packaging. And the price point. It was often higher than prestige, but it didn't have to be so expensive. And then finally, distribution. So niche fragrances, by nature, were limited to small boutiques and perfumeries because if we look at those original brands, there wasn't this big embracement from the department stores. So often they had to create their own small store. If we think of the example of Diptyque, you have three friends in the 1960s who went to art school together and decided to buy fabrics and carpets from the UK and bring them back and sell them in Saint-Germain, and decided to then create candles and fragrances. It was that simple of a business. And then occasionally you'd have small perfumeries that would support these small brands. So if we look at this now and have a conversation about how things have changed, which might help us to understand how we have to redefine niche. Creativity. How many niche brands are still led by an in-house perfumer or creative director? And this is no judgment. This is, you can still create beautiful fragrances outside of this model. But if this was what niche typically was, do we have to rethink how we're talking about niche? A brand identity. Small, independent, agile, focus on storytelling. Yes, I'd completely agree that storytelling is still a big part of niche, but small, a conversation we often have to have is when a brand starts small, for example, say Byredo, but they're acquired and they become bigger. You find them in duty-free stores, you find them in every department store. Does that then change the definition of them sitting under our niche banner? Visual identity, this I think is the marker for niche that hasn't evolved so much. I think if we were to go into the fair, you'll see most people are still following that format of having a uniform packaging and stock bottle, or a custom bottle even. Interesting, I was having a conversation with a perfumer and asking how he chose the projects that he wanted to put forward to a sales team to say, I'm interested in doing that. And his response was, look, if they have a custom bottle, I know they have the money and the means and they're serious. Whereas I think if you were to go 10, 15 years ago, most people were quite happy with a stock bottle. Price point is very varied. I'm finding we have brands that are moving in one direction, saying, oh, everything is very expensive and luxurious in pricing, so let's create niche that's accessible and affordable. And then you have everyone going the other direction where you have things that are entering into the luxury market. So there's almost like a luxury niche versus an accessible niche, which is happening under this one banner of niche at the moment. And then distribution. If you talk to Michael Edwards, who's been tracking this for his career, he talks about how during the 80s, department stores were struggling because of the grey market. And so you had major brands that you would have to go to the department store, Estee Lauder, Yves Saint Laurent, the list goes on. And you would have to buy that product there, but the grey market created this uneven playing field where why would people go and buy their opium in a department store when they could get it at a discount pharmacy down the street? So for the department stores, niche was the answer. And then we start to see niche coming in and becoming part of department store retail. So distribution, is niche about only being in small perfumeries now? Absolutely not. And we're seeing it in airports and travel retail. It's really opening up. So we can move this to Q&A, but my thought on niche and what it is today is that actually it's not so much that things aren't niche anymore, which is what we hear a lot of. I think it's just that the circle of niche has broadened, and that maybe we're at a point where we can start to create subcategories under niche to encapsulate what everyone's doing. And here are the definitions that we use at Fragrances of the World. We call it a distribution, so our main focus is distribution in terms of how and where you find the fragrance in the market. But to help our administration team who are entering a lot of the data, if they discover a new brand on Instagram or online, these are the criteria that they will look at when they come to the evaluation team to say, oh, we think this is a niche brand, therefore it goes to this person, or it's a prestige brand, it'll go to another of our colleagues to manage. I think the reason why we've found it so hard to come up with a new definition of niche is that there is no one consistent answer. And I think that's okay. I think that is okay. But I think it's just about broadening our appreciation of what niche has become. So, grazie mille. Any questions from the audience about, I guess, our data that we collected, if you want any more insights? Or I'm also keen to hear from you about your thought. I know we have many people from all parts of the industry in the room today. What are your thoughts on niche and where it should be, how we should describe it, define it? Valentina, is there a roaming mic for questions, or they just talk really loud? They just shout. Okay. We have one question there.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks for the conference. I have a question. Do you have any idea about the future trends for 2024? It's the first question. And second, what is the difference between soft amber and amber? So which kind of perfume do you classify in these two family?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks for the question. So I can answer the first one very easily. So for us, the difference between amber and soft amber, when Michael created the fragrance wheel, he was using the French Society of Perfumers classification system as one of his reference points. So they have a classification called, at the time it was Oriental, so they had semi-Oriental and Oriental. He found because he was working with retailers and everyday consumers, a question that would often come up when the salesperson presented a semi-Oriental is that the consumer thought they weren't getting all their money's worth. Oh, this is only half an Oriental? So he thought, okay, let me think about this. What is really the difference between Oriental and a semi-Oriental? So we can probably describe it, and as I mentioned, when we're classifying, part of our I guess, thought process is to go back to iconic fragrances that really symbolize a classical version of that family. So for us, the classic for amber is Shalimar from Guerlain, and then the soft amber is Opium from Yves Saint Laurent. So when you take a classic amber with all of that vanilla and you know, often, you know, sure, you might have some leathery notes like castoreum or some civet, but you have some of those spices and it's vanilla. If you strip some of that away, but you're adding more things like resins, so myrrh, incense, with spices, and often there's a floral aspect to it. So orange flower, which gives you that spicy facet as well, and the honeyed effect from the flower. This is where we would classify, and what those would be the things that we're looking for when we would say, okay, this is more soft amber rather than classic amber. And then the second part of your question, which I'm going through my head and trying to remember. What was the first part of the question again? Oh, trends, yeah, 2024, okay. Look, I think for me, there's always a bleed. There's never, it's not like fashion where, you know, you have a fashion week and then all of a sudden, you know, hemlines on skirts have gone up 30 centimeters and then boom, boom. It's never that sharp. There's always a bleed between the years. I think we've seen the icy wood trend that I spoke about. That's probably, I would say, sort of peaked in its lowering. I think vanilla, we're still going to see a lot more vanilla this year. I think Erica pointed out this idea, coconut being very, very big, and I agree. I'm seeing a lot of tuberose as well. I think, you know, you have a lot of these ingredients which are not new to perfumery, but they just seem to cycle around, and tuberose we're seeing a lot of. I mentioned the leather note as well, so leather, but it's a really green, so, you know, a lot of quinoline, but it's, you know, it's sort of almost like a galbanum leather, a lot of vetiver, so smoky as well, but spicy, like fresh spicy, like a lot of cardamom. That's another trend that I've sort of picking up on that I'm watching. I haven't really talked about it, but I'm watching it. Trying to think what else for 2024. Musk, I mean, we reported on this during COVID. Like, people wanted comfort scents. They wanted two things. They wanted green fragrances, which helped them to feel as though they're in nature when we're all locked up in our houses. So we saw a lot of brands doing things around green, around nature, around sort of very verdant, woody notes. That has sort of calmed down because, yeah, green fragrances, I think most people we speak to say are hard to sell, so they sort of have their moment and then they go away very quickly. But the comfort scent thing, so a lot of like ambrette, a lot of benzoin, like milky sandalwood, a lot of these themes and the soft muskiness, I think that has continued and we're still seeing a lot of that. But now that's almost blurring into the white floral thing with the tuberose. So you're having these sort of almost solar floral moments that are white floral, but very musky and powdery, but still quite modern. Like, they don't have that retro feel that a lot of aldehydes and musks often give a fragrance. Yeah. Those would be my 2024 picks.
Clayton.
Yes.
Clayton, here.
Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. So, and then we'll
Hi,
come
hello.
Back. Hello.
I have one question regarding this redefinition of niche. What do you think about it? Because, for example, for brands like Byredo or Jo Malone, do you think that they are still niche, or because of the scope and popularity, it can be differently seen? So,
yeah.
What do you think?
My thought is that if we think about what we have, if we're not talking niche, then things are either prestige, mass, luxury, lifestyle. The industry has these definitions already. But if we remove those definitions, we're really talking about a group of fragrances. So that used to be the majority of what was launched into the market. Now that's changed. Now niche is the biggest category. So I think we're at a stage now where niche, we can break it down into smaller subcategories. And just, I mean, for me, the definition of niche, meaning a small part of something bigger, it's no longer relevant. So I think we have to find new language to help break this big part of niche into its categories. Yeah, that's my thought, but it's still a work in progress for us. Yeah.
Hi.
Oh, yes. Hello.
Yes, a question. I haven't seen any data about Americas, and especially Latin America, the division. And in your vision, are around the world these fragrance families the same, or do they change depending where you move?
That's a good question. So to start with America, I didn't have it because I was only showing the top 3 growth regions. North America wasn't in growth. Neither was Latin America actually either. So we're seeing a little bit of a delay in launch numbers there, which meant they didn't get a mention. And then to your other question, yeah, it is really interesting when you travel the world, as we do. Our team was in Dubai for Beauty World, and then earlier in the year as well, we were there, and actually spent some time with the team at CPL. So Rauya, amazing leader of that division, took us on a tour through the Dubai Mall to really point out there's some specific accords that you have in Middle Eastern perfumery that don't necessarily translate into Western perfumery. Sure, everything fits within the wheel, but if we think the wheel was designed, we call it mossy woods. It's a Chypre accord. So these are European accords originally. So we're trying to take something that was created outside of that world and sort of fit it into a Western concept. Which, look, it does, but there are definitely some interesting accords. I encourage everyone to explore next time if you have the opportunity to be in the Middle East, to explore their perfumery, because, yeah, there's some cool things. Oh, yes, hello.
You're now seeing. Sorry, can you say a few words about the categories within niche you see forming today?
Yeah. Internally, we have our own subcategories, but we don't publish them externally. So some of the, I'd call them characteristics that we were looking for. So one is if it's a perfumer owned, so it's an independent in-house perfumer niche brand. This is something that we've been tracking. Another one is if they're natural. So if there's a fragrance brand that is only working with 100% natural raw materials. The other one that we're looking at is, I think, luxury. So at the moment, we have luxury and niche, but I think we're at a point now where we need to have a luxury category within niche. So we're talking about, brands like Xerjoff. I think, anything where if we're looking at a bottle that's over, €500, you have to separate that out from a small brand that's in, creating things in their backyard and putting a nice label on it and selling it on Etsy. You can't compare those two brands, so we need to look at that. Yeah.
Hi, here in the middle.
Oh, hello.
Thank you so much for your insights. I do have a question about, because you told us about the offline development, that it's increasing the sales in offline shopping, retail, but do you have any insights about online selling, or do you see any trends in this landscape?
Yeah. I think if you were to imagine back to pre-COVID and you were talking to someone that doesn't work in our industry, and ask them, do they buy fragrance online? Most of them would say, I don't trust myself. And even people that are very experienced with fragrance won't buy online. They're like, no, I have to go to the store and smell it first. So the innovation for us was our fragrance finders. So a product that we work with retailers. We have their Google shopping feed. So it's live. It's embedded into their website. And it will make recommendations. If you remember to the guidebook that I showed early in the presentation, Michael's philosophy was, okay, tell me your favorite 3 fragrances and I can tell you what you should try. So he's literally translated that, we call it an algorithm, into a computer program which sits within, it's embedded into the retailer's website. And it really helps consumers to be confident in their purchasing. Sure, you need other things. It can't just be that. It's having a good return. Like, it should be easy to return the product if you make the wrong choice. There's a lot of other, retail theatre that has to happen online to make the experience rich and engaging. And I think there's retailers that do it really well, and there's some that are still, kind of finding their feet there. But I think, yeah, that would be, I think the next thing for me is obviously AI, and we didn't really touch on that here, but I think everyone is questioning, AI's role in both online experience and in store. I'm waiting for the first brand to use the new Apple, vision to take us on a journey with fragrance. I think it's exciting. Any other? No more questions? We have two. I'll go here and then I'll go to the front.
Hello.
Hello.
I'm very surprised that you didn't insist that the Middle East influenced a lot the niche, but not only the niche, because the ingredients that you mentioned, incense, tobacco, soft leather or dark leather,
Yeah.
it's something very influenced by the
Yeah.
Middle East.
Yeah.
Same, you spoke about the long lasting.
Mhm.
It's also influenced by the Middle East.
Yes.
And you mentioned tobacco vanille and Baccarat Rouge. We know that it had the success thanks to the Middle East region.
Yes.
So don't you think that in the future, we need to focus a little bit more on the Middle East, looking what this region is offering to forecast what the Western countries are going to develop?
Yeah, it's true, and you're completely correct. I did think of this. I think for me, it was something because I was focusing on last year. I think the Middle East has had a huge impact on perfumery. Westerners wouldn't know about oud if it wasn't for the Middle East. It's important. I think the interesting thing for me is the impact, and we didn't talk about this, but the influence of retailers on our trends. And when you have Western brands that are doing great business in the Middle East, what probably most people outside of the Middle East don't understand is that the feedback that's coming from the Middle East to those brands is influencing what we're all getting in our stores. So yeah, it's very important. Yeah. So I don't know what's next though. From what are you going to give us next? Yeah. Yeah. Cool. And then I think we had one more. Okay. Yeah.
So once a brand grows to the size such as Sergioff, MFK, Creed, and Pam Pam Somali, how do these brands differ? So what are the main differentiation for these brands as opposed to the leaping collections from luxury brands such as Armani, Hermes, and so on, other than perhaps the perceived focus that comes from being a perfumery house with the main focus being on perfumery?
Yeah.
What are the other differentiating factors?
I think for me, a lot of it's cultural. And when I say cultural, I mean corporate culture. So, it's how daring those companies are willing to be. I think if you've come from a company like Sergioff, where you've started small, you're used to taking risk. If you have a tolerance for risk as a company, as a corporate company, then you're going to make more daring decisions. If you're a luxury brand that's kind of going into fragrance, and we saw this with, and I'm not saying these companies are adverse to risk, but if you think of a brand like Celine, which hadn't done fragrance for over a decade, and then all of a sudden has a collection to sort of compete in this market. I think it really comes down to the corporate culture, and you'll find some companies are much more daring, others prefer to play it safe. I think the big thing is financial risk as well. The bigger you are, the bigger the cost of getting your product out there. And so some companies will be willing to take a gamble, and I think that's also where strong creative direction from a person really makes a difference. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. We'll wrap up there. But thanks for coming along for this morning. I hope that was interesting. And if you have any more questions, remember I'm here, Margaret, Erica here. So we'll stick around for a little bit to answer any other questions you have if you want to talk to us one-on-one. Cool. Thank you.